So I know that I hurried. What I wanted you to understand. So let's go back and let's do this again. And we're going to continue forward, but it's really important to understand where we're going from. So, step one, autonomic nervous system and skeletal nervous system. Okay, the autonomic nervous system says, "Hey, we need more air. Let's do something." That's what influences muscles. Skeletal somatic nervous system is what contracts my external intercostals and my diaphragm. On that occurring, my thoracic cavity gets larger. Thoracic cavity gets larger, volume increases. Volume increases in this closed space. Pressure decreases. Pressure decreases in my intrapleural space relative to in my alveolus. Therefore, the pressure in my alveolus will cause my alveolus to expand, so the volume of my alveolus expands. When the volume of my alveolus expands, the molecules inside my alveolus distribute, causing a decrease in pressure in my alveolus. That pressure is now less than atmospheric pressure, so air molecules from the atmosphere enter inside the alveolus. Good? Okay. So now we're going to, because this was going from equilibrium after exhale to our inhalation. Okay. Now we're going to go over here and we're going to look just at our inhalation. So we have just inhaled. I've inhaled until the pressure here matches the pressure here, at which point I'll have no net change of molecules, right? Okay. So I'm at equilibrium. Well, now what happens? I'm going to go back to looking at my intrapleural space and tell me again, what initiated all of this? What initiated all of this? The muscle contraction, right? Well, what do the muscles do after they contract? They relax. So now I'm going to have relaxation of my thoracic cavity muscle and my diaphragm. I put our orange dots back in because the muscle movement is going to change my cavity itself. So now I put the orange dots back in. I'm going to take the green dots away so we can just focus on the intrapleural space. So we're going to go back to our PV equals nRT. And when our muscles relax, our external intercostals relax and the ribs move inferiorly and put pressure on the chest, because remember before they moved up and out. So now they move down and in. My diaphragm, which was flattened when it contracted, goes back up. And, going back to here. So we're looking back at our PV equals nRT. Again, these muscle movements are going to influence what? My volume. And what's it going to do with my volume? It's going to decrease my volume. Okay? If I decrease my volume, what's that going to do? It's going to, come on, it's going to increase my pressure. That's specific to this, right? I'm increasing my pressure here. So again, my molecules, because the volume is smaller, my molecules are in a smaller space, so they make more collisions. So my volume decreased, so my pressure increased. Again, we weren't looking at nRT because this is a closed system, right? If my pressure here increases, what's that going to influence? Correct. It's going to put pressure on the alveolus, causing the alveolus to get smaller. When the alveolus gets smaller, let's look back at PV equals nRT. When our alveolus gets smaller, what just moved? Increased pressure, decreased volume from the alveolus, right? Decreased volume of the alveolus, increased pressure. And when we increase pressure, what changes? Our number of moles. Our number of moles decreases, right? When we were inhaling and the alveolus got larger, pressure inside the alveolus decreased, so then more air molecules moved into the alveolus, increasing the number of moles, or the N, inside my alveolus, right? Now what's happened is volume has decreased, pressure has increased, causing this volume to decrease, causing this pressure to increase, pressure in the alveolus higher than atmospheric pressure, causing some of those air molecules to move out, therefore my decrease in N, right? And that's going to happen until I reach equilibrium. And then I'm going to start the exhale. Well, not start the exhale. I'm exhaling until I go back to where I started. So as I'm exhaling, air moves out. Air moves out until I reach equilibrium. And once I've reached equilibrium, this is my equilibrium after exhalation, and that's where I started again. So you have to consider two different parts of this. Part one, you have to look at the changes in pressure and volume in the intrapleural cavity. How come you don't have to consider moles? Because it's a closed system, so the number of moles doesn't change. When we're looking at the alveolus relative to the atmosphere, we have to consider pressure, volume, and the number of moles. And that really is where respiratory gets more complicated, because you're juggling three different things. And in juggling these three different things, it's not as if one stays static, one changes, so therefore the other changes. All of these are constantly moving, which is what makes this more complicated. Okay, so then again, we start over. We contract, this expands, volume increases, right? Causing, oh my goodness, I have a lot of color changes up here. Pressure to decrease. Now, wait a minute. Did anyone see that funky little, I didn't even realize I had it animated like that. What did I just do? I just opened this cavity, right? So now it is no longer a closed system. So now, well, first of all, we call that a pneumothorax, right? Literally air in the thoracic cavity. So now, are we just looking at P and at V? No, now we're also looking at number of moles, because this is an open system now. So N comes into play. So let's look at what happens. My volume increases, right? When my volume increases, what's my pressure going to do? Decrease. And when my pressure decreases, the pressure here is less than atmospheric pressure, and air just comes right on in to my pleural cavity. If air comes into my pleural cavity, therefore N increases, my pressure between here and here equalizes. Does that make sense? Okay. If my pressure between those two equalizes, then I have more air coming in here until eventually this fills. Now remember, it was the increase in volume causing the decrease in pressure. Okay. So it was the increase in volume causing the decrease in pressure here that allowed the alveolus to contract, right? Okay. However, when this opens and my volume increases, air comes in here and my corresponding pressure increases, right? And that pressure increase here increased pressure here is going to do what to this? It's going to put pressure on it, and it's going to make it smaller, causing it to go from this now to this. And what do we call that? Collapsed lung. Because we do not have the pressure differential here between the intraalveolar and the intrapleural space, because the pressure in the intrapleural space is the same as atmospheric pressure, this can no longer expand. And that's why a pneumothorax is so bad. You guys know I always give you first-hand examples. So I told you guys that when my uncle first went into surgery, when he went into the emergency room, it was because he was having difficulty breathing. And they went here into the pleural cavity. It was closed, right? So it wasn't open with the outside. But again, why does open to the outside matter? It increases the pressure, right? When he went into the emergency room, they took out 600 milliliters of fluid in here. Fluid that was, being produced from the serous membranes, because remember, serous membranes make serous fluid. There was irritation because there was cancer in the lung. There was cancer in the serous membrane, and there was cancer in the serous So the body, in response to those increasing masses, the whole purpose of that fluid is to decrease friction. So it's producing additional fluid to try and keep these enlarged areas from bumping up against each other. What's the problem with that? Come on. Too much pressure, because this is what type of system? A closed system. So I'm going to jump backwards. Let's go back to where it's closed. Really, it's closed at some point. Promise. You can see now why it takes so the system was closed. This, even when the volume increased, because I had increased fluid, because my uncle had increased fluid in here relative to normal, the pressure in here never decreased enough to allow full inflation of the alveolus, which is why he felt like he could never catch his breath. Because no matter how deeply he inhaled, high pressure here prevented full expansion of the alveolus. And the whole idea of our alveoli fully expanding is because that's how much air we need to bring into exchange. So that was that Monday in the emergency room. Monday in the emergency room, they drained 600 mLs. He goes in Friday morning, as in 4 days later. Goes in Friday morning, and as I've so lovingly called him to you guys, Dr. Dick goes in, comes out, and says, I drained, and this is his left pleural cavity only, I drained 4,000 cc's, 4 liters. So, is that a 1 liter bottle? Liter. 4 of these out of his left pleural cavity. And remember, I showed you, and I said, this is way out of proportion, right? Because remember, we went back to that earlier picture where we're only talking about this really, really narrow space along the thoracic cavity. So, clinically, is it a surprise he couldn't breathe? No, because the pressure here was so high, no matter how much he did a forced inhalation, he pushed that diaphragm as flat as it could go. He pulled those external intercostals. And then you start to, when you do a forced inhale, when you go, not just, okay, so let's do just a normal breath, okay? Got a normal breath? Yeah, this is a normal breath, right? Right? I mean, that's what you're all doing now. If we do, right? We have to contract extra muscles. So now we start using all different kinds of abdominal muscles. And even when he did his all, he was doing this the maximum he could, because there was 4 liters. I mean, I want you to imagine just this space here, adding 4 liters, let alone not even half, because it's, the heart, oh, and by the way, it was this left lung, and that's the smaller of your lungs, that's the smaller of your pleural spaces, and it's adding 4 liters. So, no wonder he couldn't breathe. So then they put a drainage tube in. And when they put the drainage tube in, it's closed, so it's not open to the air. And then however many times a day, a week, whatever, you open it up, and the fluid that is in that pleural cavity is able to drain. Then you close it back up and you do it again. Well, it costs about 30 times because of all of the dressers, 30 times. It costs about $30 each time because of all of the dressings and stuff, and you know, all of that costs. My uncle didn't want to be a financial burden on anyone, and he couldn't afford it, so he had it drained once every 3 days. Needless to say, I was quite unhappy. But there's this, if anyone's interested, it was extremely cathartic for me. There's this Portuguese tradition where when somebody dies, after somebody has died, then somebody, family outside of the family, whatever, this was someone who my uncle knew, none of us really knew. He brought us a plate. And he said, anyone who has any anger at Mike, come hold on the plate. And at first we're all like, no, we love him. He just, and they're like, come on, you're not angry at anything. And I'm like, I'm angry because he only changed his drain tube once every, or drained his drain tube once every 3 days. I'm angry because he started having problems in April, and he was 64, and he didn't get Social Security until he was 65, so he didn't go to the doctor until September, when he could have called me, and I would have gone into debt for him. So I had anger. And we all had some type of anger. So we all get together, and we all stand around different sides of this plate, and we all hold it, and we all pile all of that anger on that plate. And then when everybody's ready, smash that plate, and all of that anger goes with it. And it was amazingly cathartic, and it is a tradition that I will carry on. So when you hear me talk about the eating drain tube, I'm telling you this, not because I'm still angry, because I let that go. But folks, pay attention to your intensity. Are they not getting the help they need? Are they not taking care of themselves the way they're supposed to because they can't Because sometimes there are things that you can do to help. Eventually, his drain tube stopped draining. So what's the first thought when the drain tube stops draining? It's clogged, right? But that means taking out the drain tube from the pleural cavity, putting in another one. That's a surgical procedure. They go do a PET scan, CAT scan. We're not going to take out the drain tube because the problem isn't that the drain tube is clogged. The problem is all of this is now filled with cancer. So there is no fluid, essentially no fluid to drain, because all of that space has been taken up by cancer. Okay? So you've got to think beyond just the obvious, because for those of us in the family who've never dealt with anything like this before, we're like, okay, needs to go have it, whether that means if it's flush it, or he has to have another procedure and having one tube put in. I didn't have any experience. It never ever occurred to me that it would fill this entire cavity. And to give you perspective, time-wise, he had his first surgery that I went down for October 18th. When they checked his drain tube and said it was, and said that the cancer had filled the pleural cavity, it was less than 4 weeks later, right? Because Thanksgiving was on the 22nd, he died on the 20th, and he'd already been out of the hospital since he was in the hospital when I flew down, whatever that Thursday was, and I let him go on Friday. So we're talking 20th, 18th, about the 16th, okay? In that time, his pleural cavity had gone from having enough room for 4,000 cc's of fluid to full of cancer, because lung cancer is an extremely aggressive cancer. So when you have your patients, keep all of the various pieces of knowledge that you have in your head. Hey, it could be a clogged drain. Maybe you need to just flush it with saline. But first, let's tell the doctor, hey, let's get some tests. You know, I recommend tests. Great. In the meantime, are you changing your dressing? Because it starts to get red. And we thought he had an infection because it's only changing it every 3 days. Ended up being cellulitis, so it wasn't an infection. But one of the things that you guys want to emphasize to your patients again and again, any changes, you let us know. Because when I had my bariatric surgery, you're supposed to drink water nonstop, little tiny cups. So like, you know, when you take NyQuil and then you have that tiny ass little plastic cup, I'm supposed to drink one of those every 6 minutes, as long as I was awake. Okay? It hurt. I mean, it physically hurt my stomach. And so then I went from trying to drink that whole thing, I went and bought a baby sippy cup. Because that's going to be a smaller volume and a smaller volume. And it still hurt. And I had the nurse information, I had the dietitian information, I had the doctor information. Call me if you have any problems. I'm not going to bother anybody. And then I had an ulcer. And that ulcer even water can hurt. So you really have to work with your patients to say, okay, you're going to be going through a lot of stuff. And a lot of it's going to be normal. Some of it may not be, but to you it's all brand new. Let me decide what's normal and what needs further consideration. So any change you see, call me. Most of the time you're going to call me and I'm going to go, that's exactly what should be happening. But if something goes wrong and you haven't bothered to call me, then everything we're trying to do is being defeated. So anytime you see a change, anytime anything happens that was unexpected by you, even if it's expected by me, call me. Leave a message. Now, so many doctors and nurse practitioners and stuff, you can email them. Right? Make sure that your patients know that open line of communication. And then the thing I'm going to say before we go back to this again, all related, is did I ever talk to you guys about hospice nursing? Okay. For most people, when you think about, I want to be a nurse, most people think about hospital nurses. Okay. There's also doctors' office nurses. There's infection control nurses. I will tell you, regardless of your religious persuasion, take mine for the commonality of the phrase. There is a special place in heaven for hospice nurses. as being able to take care of patients that you know are going to die. That's why it's hospice. Right? These are patients that are going to die. And their families. We were so lucky. We had a hospice nurse. Young, like 25. And I don't know if they have to be RNs, LVNs, I don't know. Huh? LVNs. But still, remember that's licensed vocational nurse, still a nurse. Okay? Just this darling little thing. At first I was worried because she was single the entire 12-hour shift. And I'm like, it's not what I want to see. And we were chatting about all kinds of things. I'm like, I don't want you to take care of my uncle. Great that you're talking to me. Blah, blah, blah. Next nurse comes on for the 12-hour shift, and she can cite everything. Medications, times, but damn. Really, really impressive. What's the problem? Okay? Do Brittany and just because you're in front of me. Brittany, I'm leaving my 12-hour shift. Brittany's coming on for her 12-hour shift. Okay, so the patient, blah, 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 blah. By the way, this is true. Have you wake up normally at 3 o'clock in the morning because he's having difficulty breathing. He had some kind of cause anxiety. I increased this medication by this much, and then this, and then 2 hours later I did this, and 2 hours later I did this, and then this, and then this. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you to do that. I'm leaving. How prepared do you feel? Well, right? I want notes. Okay? She was awesome. But I wanted notes. So she was there 2 nights in a row. And then I asked her, I said, are you going to be here tomorrow night? And she says, well, no, not exactly. What the hell does well, no, not exactly mean? And she says, I'm not going to be here the next 2 nights. She said, but my mom is. Her mom, who's named Brittany, was our night shift nurse the next 2 nights. And personality-wise, amazing. As a nurse, completely opposite. Brittany took beautiful, detailed notes of everything. And the next nurse that came on shift, Brittany took pictures with her phone of all of her notes, and she texted them to the next nurse. Because I guess with hospice, they have to turn in their notes. Okay, so do them on give them triplicate paper or something. She took pictures of all of it, gave it to the next nurse. So the next nurse had all of the information. And when Brittany came back the next night, I said to her, I said, you know what? I said, I adore your daughter. And we'd already said, oh my God, we love her, blah, 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 blah. I said, but you need to teach her this. Because in medicine, if you don't document it, it didn't happen. You know, Angela says to Brittany, hey, I gave half an ml of morphine sublingual at 2 a.m. Well, it's now 10 hours into your 2-hour shift. Right? So it's 5 o'clock at night, you've been there since 7 o'clock. Had 5 minutes with Angela that just vomited on this information at me. And the doctor calls because patients complained of pain and said, well, what's been the schedule for the last 24 hours? And Brittany's like, well, I did this, but what about the night nurse? How great does it sound to say, I don't remember what she said? Right? That doesn't make you look very good. So take this as a people, but I was getting at is all of those nurses were not only amazing to my uncle, they were amazing to us. And I remember at one point in the middle of the night, he was breathing really, really roughly. And I just kind of lost it. And Brittany came and she sat by me. And she's talking me through, hysterical, she's talking me through all the physiology of what's happening, all of the anatomy of what's happening. And part of my brain is thinking, I know this. Part of my brain is going, oh, I kid you not. Oh, I need to remember this to tell my students. Because that's, your brain does crazy things. But at the same time, she's got Kleenex for me. She's holding my hand. She puts her arm around me. Am I her patient? No. She has no responsibility to me. And I said to her as I'm sobbing, I said, Brittany, how do you do this? How do you go in knowing that your patients are going to die? And she said, because my job is to make that transition. It's not to stop it. It's not going to stop. She said, but my job is to make that transition for my patients as comfortable as possible and as comfortable for their family as possible. And I will never forget Brittany. And I hope that that is the type of medical professional that you aspire to be. Like I said, I wasn't a patient when no one was a patient. My high school friend and my sister weren't patients. My uncle was a patient. But he took just as much time and attention and care of us as he did with my uncle. Breathing, respiration. Okay, so mechanics of breathing. We have air moving into and out of the lungs as a result of pressure gradients, because how do gases and fluids move? Down their pressure gradients. Okay, so the mechanics of breathing describes how we cause those changes in pressure gradients. Well, if we're having air moving, that's flow, right? And we talked about flow when we talked about cardiac forces. So the force that determines whether or not air flows, the direction in which air flows, and the strength of that movement is the pressure gradient. As we've said, the atmospheric pressure remains constant during a single breathing cycle. When I breathe in, when I breathe out, the atmospheric pressure isn't going to change. So alveolar pressure and to some degree intrapleural pressure affects the gradients. The intrapleural pressures are dependent strictly on volume. The alveolar pressure is pressure, volume, and number of moles. So Boyle's law, pressure and volume are inversely related. And we can change alveolar pressure by changing alveolar volume. We can change intrapleural pressure by changing intrapleural volume. We can change intrapleural volume, which changes intrapleural pressure, which changes alveolar volume, which changes alveolar pressure, which changes the number of moles in the alveolus. However, just like any tubing that we have, when our fluid or our gas is moving, because it moves through a tube, we have resistance. And the resistance comes from the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveoli, all of the little bumps and grooves, because this isn't a smooth passageway. Okay? We also know resistance is related to the radius, right? We looked at this when we were looking at the cardiovascular system. If a vessel dilates, how does my resistance change? It decreases. There is less resistance if I vasodilate, and more resistance when I vasoconstrict. The same is true with the respiratory pathways. If my bronchi, bronchodilate, sorry, brain fart. If my respiratory tubes bronchodilate, my resistance decreases. And if I have bronchoconstriction, my resistance increases. So remember, back when we were looking at cardiovascular, we said flow was our pressure. In the case of cardiovascular, our MAP divided by our total peripheral resistance, or our TPR, right? The amount of pressure in the system from beginning to end, divided by the resistance in the system from beginning to end, gave us the rate of flow in the cardiovascular system. Same thing here. Our difference in pressure between the atmosphere and the alveoli divided by the resistance through our respiratory passageways between the atmosphere and the alveoli determine the flow of air into or out of the alveoli. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's the exact same concept that we looked at when we looked at cardiovascular. So, really quickly, in this case, we're looking at a closed system. So, no change in moles, no change in temperature. So, N and T are constant, R is always constant. So, all we're looking at how changes in pressure affect volume. Here, I have a given volume, and at this given volume, a given pressure is measured. If I decrease the volume, so in this case, my volume went from a value of 2 down to a value of 1. I halved the volume, so I doubled the pressure, okay? Because they're inversely related. If I tripled the volume, the pressure would drop to a third, okay? So this is what's happening inside the intrapleural space, because it's a closed system. In the alveoli, it's not this simple, because we do have a volume change, which causes a pressure change. But because it's an open system, that also causes a change in the number of moles. So, what factors influence the intra-alveolar pressure, inside an alveolus? Okay, how much air is in the alveolus, right? That's N. The volume or size of the alveolus, that's V. Remember, the question is what determines the pressure? And we were looking at pressure, volume, and number of moles. So what influences pressure? The number of moles in the volume, right? That's what that says. Okay. The lungs expand as our alveolar volume increases. Because remember in my picture I showed a single alveolus, but there are hundreds of thousands of alveoli in each lung. So as the volume of each one alveolus increases, the pressure in each one alveolus decreases, which means that the pressure inside my entire lung decreases. And now because the intra-alveolar pressure is less than atmospheric pressure, air goes down its pressure gradient from high in the atmosphere to lower in the lungs. And that's how we have air enter the lungs. Okay? Then, when we've stopped having that low pressure in the intrapleural cavity, the lungs are surrounded by, the alveoli are surrounded by elastic fibers. So when we get that increase in pressure, they recoil back to their resting size. So their volume decreases, alveolar pressure increases. It has to increase higher than what? Atmospheric pressure, so that we can exhale. So let's look at this, and there's a lot going on. And I used to have, and I'm not 25 slides that explain all of this step by step. I would go into RT, or you work with a pulmonologist, then you'll get all of those little details. So what we're looking at here is, here I'm looking at how much air is into or out of the lungs. Okay. When I have a full exhale, I'm at 0. I inhale, I exhale, I'm back to 0. So that's what this graph represents. This graph represents changes in the pressure inside the alveolus relative to my blue dotted line, which is atmospheric pressure. Okay. We know that atmospheric pressure. So this, and when I say volume here, we're talking about the amount of air entering or exiting the lungs. So my intra-alveolar pressure, the pressure inside my alveoli relative to atmospheric pressure. I start with contraction of my thoracic and diaphragm muscles, causing my intrapleural pressure, or excuse me, causing my intrapleural volume to increase, causing my intrapleural pressure to decrease, causing my alveolar volume to increase, causing my alveolar pressure to decrease, causing air to start coming in, increasing the number of moles, right? And that's going to continue and continue and continue, and more air is coming in until this is the part where students start to get confused. Okay? They're like, all right, wait a minute. So this is my maximum difference between my alveolus and my atmospheric pressure. Okay, so this is the lowest that my intra-alveolar pressure is going to be. Right now, my alveoli are going to start recoiling again. Right, so they're going to start getting smaller, which means the pressure is increasing. Right? We see that pressure is increasing. If the pressure is increasing, why is air still coming in? It's still lower than atmospheric pressure. Okay, so now I'm going to press less hard, and it's still harder than here, right? Okay, so here, less pressure than before, but still lower pressure than atmospheric pressure. So air continues to come in. Air will come in as long as my intraalveolar pressure is less than atmospheric pressure. So I started out at equilibrium, they're the same. Then my volume, thoracic cavity, intrapleural space, the volume of my alveolus is increasing and increasing, so the pressure decreases, air is coming in, decreases to maximum decrease, air is coming in, pressure starting to build, but because it's still less than atmosphere, air is still coming in. Make sense? Until I get to my maximum inhale. When I'm at my maximum inhale, the pressure inside my alveolus now matches atmospheric pressure. So there's no net change. But then, what happens to start this? What's the beginning in all of this? The muscles now start to relax. When the muscles relax, my intrapleural volume gets smaller. My intrapleural volume gets smaller. My intrapleural pressure increases. Increase in my intrapleural pressure, decrease of volume of my alveoli. Volume decreases, pressure increases. We were at equilibrium with atmospheric. So now, as those muscles relax and that alveolus decreases in volume, pressure increases, and I start to exhale. And it's going to decrease and decrease and decrease until I've got my maximum, sorry, I said that wrong, didn't I? Pressure is going to increase and increase and increase above atmospheric till I get my maximum intraalveolar pressure. And then that's going to start to decrease. The reason I'm still exhaling is because it's still greater than atmospheric. So anytime your alveolar pressure is less than atmospheric, air is coming in. Anytime your alveolar pressure is higher than atmosphere, air is going out. When they are the same, there's no net movement. And notice, they're the same when we've emptied our breath, because there's that momentary pause. And they are the same for that fraction of a second that we go from inhaling to exhaling. And then that fraction of a second when we go from exhaling to inhaling, and so on and so forth. Okay? Does that make sense? If you go look at this on the internet, you're going to find some of these that are way more complicated, because in addition to looking at breath volume and intraalveolar pressure, sometimes they include the transpulmonary pressure, so the pressure between the intrapleural space and the alveoli. Sometimes they include how the number of moles changes, and it gets complicated. Realize that this breath volume is an indication of moles, right? Because breath volume, how much air is coming in, is how much number of moles that comes in. Okay? Now let's go back to another friend, and I use the term friend loosely. Now let's look at compliance. So remember when we were talking about cardiovascular, compliance is how much my tube, whatever my tube was, whether in the cardiovascular system we were talking about blood vessels, or in the respiratory system we're talking about trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli, how much pressure it takes to stretch. Okay. If I have a pressure of 3 what? It doesn't matter, I'm making it up. If I have a pressure of 3, something with high compliance will stretch this much with a pressure of 3. Something with low compliance will stretch this much with a pressure of 3. Okay? It's not that one stretches and one doesn't. It's how much force is needed to stretch that. You can look at it 2 ways. You can look at it, how much stress do I get with a given force? So I can say if I have a pressure force of 3, my highly compliant will stretch a lot. My one with low compliance will only stretch a little. Does that make sense? The other way I can look at it, which is the exact same thing, is if I have something that's low compliance, how much force is needed to stretch it to here? If I have something that's high compliance, how much force is needed to stretch it to here, right? If it has high compliance, do I need a lot of force or a little force to stretch it to here? A little. If something has low compliance, to get it to that same volume, I need a lot of pressure. Okay? And again, this is exactly what we talked about with the cardiovascular. Okay? That's why I said when we were doing cardiovascular, get this down here, because we're going to be looking at it again in respiratory, and we're even going to see some part of this compliance and resistance when we get to urinary. All right? So, compliance, how easily something can be stretched. The larger the compliance, the easier it is to inhale, right? How about the garden hose? No, I don't want to go there. Garden hose and fire hose are a bad example in this case, okay? Larger lung compliance. My pressure of 3 goes this much. That's going to be easier than something that has a low compliance where a pressure of 3 only gets me to here. So, it's easier to inspire, and that means I need a smaller change in transpulmonary pressure to bring in a given volume of air. What? All right. Remember, the transpulmonary pressure is the difference between the pressure in the intrapleural cavity and the pressure in the alveolus, right? Okay. And what we said was, when the pressure inside the intrapleural cavity decreases, that causes the volume of the alveolus to increase, causing the pressure inside the alveolus to decrease. Did I say that right? Did I say that wrong? Let's try this again, because I wasn't sure I said it right. If the intrapleural volume increases, the intrapleural pressure decreases. The intrapleural pressure decreases, the alveolar volume increases. The alveolar volume increases, the alveolar pressure decreases. Okay? So far, so good. All right. What this compliance is saying is, depending on how stretchy the differences, or how stretchy the alveoli are, determines how easy it is to cause that change in volume. So, let's look at our ever popular balloon. Okay? If It is a brand new balloon. And it's one of those teeny little balloons that's made up of thick plastic, thick rubber, thick, what the hell are they made out of? Latex. Thank you. I knew I wasn't getting the right words out. Made up of thick latex. They're those tiny little ones, right? And you go and you're like, right? And you see it like get enough air to just fill but not expand, right? Low compliance. So I had to put a lot of pressure in order to get the volume to expand so that air can move in. If, however, we have one of those really long balloons for making balloon animals, and those tend to be thin so that you can twist them and turn them and all of that, you go to blow those up relatively easy. If you've already started to blow it up, and then you stop and then you go to do it again, it's even easier, right? So if I have something that is already stretchy, if it has a lot of compliance, easy to stretch, then I don't need as much transpulmonary pressure. I don't need as big of a difference between the outside of the alveolus and the inside of the alveolus to make it change. Is that good? Yes? I'm not getting a whole lot of yeses this time. All right, I want to make sure. Okay, factors that affect lung compliance. Obviously, elasticity, right? The more the elastic, the less it's compliant. Think about a rubber band. If I have one of those really thick, small rubber bands, it takes a lot to pull them open. The higher the elasticity, the less compliant. On the other hand, if I have a balloon, or excuse me, if I have a rubber band that's been stretched and stretched and stretched again, so it's almost lost its elasticity, lower elasticity, greater compliance. Here's the other thing that makes a difference. Surface tension of the lungs. The lungs are coated by a mucous membrane, right? And what's the primary component of mucus? Water. And water exhibits surface tension, right? We know that water likes to stick to itself. If we put a drop of water on the counter, it makes a semicircle, right? If you see a picture of a raindrop, it's a bubble. If you're in chemistry, and you have one of your test tubes, and you put water, right? What are you looking at? The meniscus. Because what happens is water, because it likes to stick to things, sticks to the tube itself. Okay? So water likes to stick to itself. If I have an alveolus that is coated on the inside with mucus, which is primarily water, it wants to stick to itself. Is that good for inflating the lungs? No, it's not. And you may be thinking, well, water tension is so small. Okay, tell that to water striders. Those are the bugs that make use of water tension to be able to walk on water. I mean, if you look at a picture, you can literally see dents in the water where they're stepping on it, but their pressure is not enough to break that surface tension. So that surface tension is real. So because we have our alveoli that are filled with mucus, and mucus is primarily water, and water wants to stick together, what prevents our alveoli from sticking together and therefore being unable to open. Not pressure. Surfactant. You guys may remember back from anatomy, type 2 alveolar cells produce a chemical called surfactant. Surfactant is a molecule that is both hydrophilic and hydrophobic, just like plasma membrane proteins are. So the hydrophilic ends attach to the water molecules that are up against the walls of the alveoli, but you have hydrophobic ends that face towards the center of the alveolus, preventing the water from sticking to itself, keeping each alveolus open. How many of you have ever heard about preemies that are born too early and then you hear their lungs haven't developed yet, right? Does that mean they don't have lungs? No, it doesn't mean they don't have lungs. What that actually means is their lungs have not started making surfactant yet. Now, in utero, it doesn't matter, because in utero, the fetus is not exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide through the lungs. It's exchanging it through the umbilical cord, through the placenta. But as soon as you leave that comfy little warm environment, you've got to use your lungs. And if there's no surfactant, then the mucus inside those alveoli form closed. So what happens in hospitals is they, through breathing treatments, they introduce surfactant artificially to break that surface tension so those alveoli can be open until about 28 weeks, when the lungs start to produce surfactant. Okay? That doesn't mean that you won't have preemies on respiration longer than that. But that's why 28 weeks is a big deal, because 28 weeks is about where the lungs start to produce surfactant, giving the ability, everything else being okay, to be able to breathe on their own. All right. Said that. Okay, I just explained all that. Okay. So resistance, you know, as the airway gets smaller in diameter, smaller in radius, then it, oh, sorry, that's not what I was saying. Okay, so we're talking about airway resistance as a whole. So we know that resistance is how much friction we're fighting. Okay. When we go from the one trachea, which is this big, it's not this big, I'm just making it easy to see. When I go from my trachea, which is this big, to my primary bronchus, which is this big, again, it's not, humor me, what happens to my resistance? It increases. But, and there's a but, I went from this surface area of my trachea to this surface of my primary bronchus times 2, 1 for each lung, right? So when I'm looking at surface area, which is really a direct indication of friction, which is resistance, if that's my surface area of my trachea, right? If I go into my bronchi, my surface area is less, right? However, when I look at the surface area of the system at this point, my surface area is not less. In fact, does it look like this plus this equals this? What do you think it does, Anika? Okay, so I'm going to take this one.
We want to decrease resistance,
right?
More. So it's going to increase surface area.
Correct. So the point is that I'm old. Even though I go from one big tube to smaller tubes, because these tubes are more in number and not half in size. So let's say that this goes from 10 down to 8. Okay, here I have one at 10, so that's my surface area of 10. This one's 8, but this one's also 8. So now what's my combined surface area at this point in my lungs? 16. So even though I'm getting smaller with each branch, because I have so many branches, as I go through, my overall resistance actually decreases.
That makes sense?
Okay, so even though airways is smaller in diameter, because they increase in number, that keeps the overall resistance low. And we know that pressure gradient is required for air to flow, because how does the gas move down its pressure gradient? So if we want to have our air move, we need to have a small resistance, okay? And so we look at a resistance, the pressure of the resistance, the fight, it's about 1 millimeter of mercury. If we have an increase in resistance, that makes it harder to breathe. And that's because the pressure gradient needed for airflow becomes greater than that 1 millimeter of mercury. Okay. This is that these things on the corner of your desk, that's this, okay? So we're going to look at what you would have done had class not been canceled so much. I'm going to blame it on the smoking Thanksgiving. All right, so we're looking at lung volumes and capacities. we are making this in theory a closed system, right? Because we block off the nose. So the only interaction is between the lungs and this. And what we're trying to do is see how much air, because this is done through exhalation, how much air moves through here is dependent on how hard you exhale and how much air you can exhale. As that air fills this, it causes it to float more. If it floats more through a series of pulleys and all these fancy things, it shows us how our volume changes during a respiratory cycle. So let's look at this lovely thing. I would not be surprised, and I'm not saying it is, I'm telling you in the past, we've seen these on exams. So let's look at each piece of this. Yeah. Okay. Well, not the numbers, but all of the formulas. Just, I mean, this is what I want you to calculate, right? But the explanations and the formulas are all included. Okay. All right. So VT, tidal volume, that's this. And what this represents is a normal breath. And again, a normal breath not being, a normal breath being what you're all doing right now. Okay? And that's one of the hardest things to measure on the spirometers because it's really hard for people to just do a normal breath. They want to, and okay? So in a normal resting breath, you breathe in roughly 500 mL of fluid. Sorry, I'm looking at the bottle of air. So to your normal just, you exchange, you bring in about 500 mLs of air, 500 of air. Okay? So that normal volume is your tidal volume. Okay? And that's roughly half a liter. Then inspiratory reserve volume is this. And inspiratory reserve volume, up, not down, is how much more you can breathe in than normal. So, how much, so that's your inspiratory reserve volume. That's how much more you can inhale beyond your normal resting tidal volume. Okay, so here, this is my normal volume. If I inhale more than that, there is roughly 3,000 mLs, 3 additional liters that you can inhale. And again, think about it. Your normal breath. This is a huge difference. So, my inspiratory capacity then, the amount of total air that I can inhale is my tidal volume plus whatever else I can get in there. So my inspiratory capacity is my tidal volume and my inspiratory reserve volume. My tidal volume and my inspiratory reserve volume. We said tidal volume is about 500 mLs, inspiratory reserve is about 3,000 mLs. So my capacity, the maximum amount of air that I can inhale, when I say I, remember these are averages, is 3,500 mLs. Okay. Then we have the expiratory reserve volume. And my expiratory reserve volume is what I can blow out beyond my normal exhale. So my normal inhale, I have my normal exhale. And then blow it all out. No, keep going. Come on, come on. That's my expiratory reserve volume, right? That was not a normal breath. That was everything else that I could get out. Okay. So then, when I look at what's called vital capacity is the total amount from my, if I went from my complete, I'm not going to do it again, I'm lightheaded. If I went from my complete empty to my complete filling, so from here, that's my vital capacity. That's my total amount. And that is my expiratory reserve volume, right? Because this is completely empty, so this is me getting back to my tidal volume, plus my tidal volume, plus my inspiratory reserve volume. So vital capacity, everything that can be exchanged is my tidal volume, my inspiratory reserve volume, and my expiratory reserve volume. By the way, I forgot to note, my expiratory reserve volume is about 1,000 mLs. So to get my vital capacity, 500 plus 3,000 plus 1,000 gives me about 4,500. Okay. Now let's look at what's called our residual volume. And the residual volume you can't measure with a spirometer because the residual volume is the amount of air that's in the lungs that isn't exchanged in that specific breath. So let's go back to the left ventricle. Remember we talked about the volume of blood that enters the left ventricle. The left ventricle contracts and X amount of blood leaves the ventricle. What do we call that X amount of blood? Stroke volume. Okay. Was my stroke volume all of the blood that was in the ventricle? No. There was some left behind. That was the residual blood. Does that mean that amount of blood sits there all the time and doesn't move and it clots? And no. It's constantly being changed and it's constantly being mixed up. That's what this residual volume is. That is when I have compressed my muscles as tight as I can, my abdominal muscles. So I've pulled my external obliques and my internal obliques and my transverse abdominis and my rectus abdominis. And I've got everything pressed. So I put the highest pressure here so that pushes my diaphragm up as far as it'll go. And I put all kinds of pressure here. When I've got that maximum amount of pressure, there's still air that's left behind. But it's not static because in my next breath, gas is going to come in, it's going to mix up, some of it's going to go, some of it's not. But using a spirometer, I can't measure how much is left behind. That's like trying to use stroke volume to tell me how much is left behind. So that's the only value here that can't be measured with the spirometer. So then, if I want to look at, okay, total amount of air in my lungs, because this vital capacity is total amount of air exchanged in a given breath. I'll get to this in a second. Actually, I'll do that now. Okay, so the functional residual capacity is the amount of air that's not normally exchanged during a normal breath. So during a normal breath, I breathe in and out 500 mLs, right? Right? Mm-hmm. During a normal breath, I don't do this 1,000 mLs of the expiratory reserve volume. During a normal breath, I don't do the residual volume. So the functional residual volume, or the functional residual capacity, is the amount of air in your lungs in a single normal breath that isn't exchanged. Does that make sense? Okay, and that's 2,200, 1,000 plus 1,200. Okay. So then total lung capacity, all of the air that's in each lung, is the amount that isn't exchanged in any one breath plus the amount that I have here plus the amount I have here plus the amount that I have here, right? If I were able to push out everything, and I'm not talking about exhale, I'm talking about an elephant stepped on my chest and all of the air came out, I'd be at zero, right? If I look at that compared to my deepest breath, at my deepest breath, I have 5,700 mLs. So my total lung capacity is 5,700 mLs. It's my normal breath plus the amount extra that I can inhale plus the amount extra that I can exhale plus the amount extra that in a single breath I just can't move. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right. That's what we just said. I like it better with the graph. Okay. That's also what we just said. Okay. Now people are going to go, ah! And I'm going to tell you, if you've got the cardiovascular down, this is easy peasy. It really is. What we're looking at here is minute ventilation. Minute ventilation says how much air is exchanged per minute. This is the exact same concept as cardiac output. How much blood leaves the heart in a minute? In order to do that, in order to figure out cardiac output, what two things do I need to know? Stroke volume. How much blood leaves the heart in every pump? So for respiration, I need to know tidal volume. And what was the second thing you said? Heartbeat, heart rate, right? If I know how much leaves the lung each beat, and I know how many beats per minute, then I know the total amount that leaves in a minute, cardiac output. Minute ventilation. What's the tidal volume? The volume exchanged per breath times respiratory rate, breaths per minute. The exact same thing. Does everybody see that? Again, this is why I said get this down in cardiovascular. It's the exact same thing. How much goes per minute? How much goes for each one times how many whatevers we do in a minute? How much volume we eject from the left ventricle each time times how many times per minute that's ejected, heart rate, so cardiac output, stroke volume times heart rate, minute ventilation. how much air is exchanged per minute. Tidal volume, how much is exchanged in a single breath, a normal relaxed breath, times the number of breaths per minute. So, normal respiratory rate, average 12 breaths per minute. Okay, we saw from the graph, normal tidal volume, 500 mLs. So, my normal minute breath ventilation, 500 mLs per breath, times 12 breaths per minute. On average, in a minute, we exchange 6 liters of air between our lungs and the atmosphere. Okay. All right. The anatomical dead space. The anatomical dead space is that air in conducting zones doesn't participate in gas exchange. I'm going to show you what that means in a second. In other words, if I look at I got my drink, right? And I want to know how much fluid I take in my one drink. Do I measure everything that went up my straw? No, because there was residual soda in my straw that didn't go into my mouth. Doesn't mean the straw didn't fill, but the amount that came into my straw also left my straw. So all that counts is the part that went beyond my straw. Here, when we're talking about the anatomical dead space, we're talking about the air that is inside that airway. And it fills when air comes in. Anything beyond that goes into the lungs, right? But if I do this, and I stop it there, I don't drink anything, right? All I did was fill my straw. So in order to actually get air in or get air out, it has to go beyond this because this is a fixed volume of air. So the reason it's called the anatomical dead space is because you always have X amount that doesn't get to the alveoli. Okay, so that's the air in the conducting zone that doesn't participate in the gas exchange, which is the anatomical dead space, and that dead space is approximately 150 mLs. So, let's go to the picture. Okay, so here I look at my alveolus. I have my fresh air, that which is coming in. I have my old air that was sitting in my respiratory channels, right? Because even when I exhaled everything, there was still air that was inside my conducting zone that didn't come out. So that's my old air. Then I inhale and I get fresh air coming in. Plus I've got that old air that now moves into my alveolus, right? Oxygen dropped off because of its partial pressure. CO2 picked up because of its partial pressure. At this point now, all of this is old air. We exhale that fresh air that was stuck in the conducting zone that never got into the alveolus goes out. Some of this old air goes out, and some of it's going to be stuck behind. How much? About 150 mLs that stays in this space. Again, just like when we were talking about with the ventricles, the amount of blood that's left behind doesn't say static. The amount of air left behind in the residual volume doesn't say static. This anatomical dead space air doesn't say static. Okay? It's constantly being exchanged. What doesn't change is the volume. Again, if I sucked up soda in my straw, but didn't drink it, and then it goes back in, and then I take up soda again, is that the exact same amount? Sorry, is that the exact same soda? No, the volume of my straw is still the same, but what molecules move through there are constantly changing. So this exchange is different molecules every time, but the volume of my conducting zone, think of it as my straw, doesn't change. Okay, so this is the end of respiratory. So the volume of air reaching, so alveolar ventilation then is how much air reaches the alveoli, because that's where the gas exchange occurs, right? Anything that's trapped inside that dead air space, that anatomical dead space, doesn't get to the alveoli because it's at the alveoli that I have my pulmonary capillaries that surround those alveoli, and the pulmonary capillaries are site of exchange, right? So it's only the air that gets actually to the alveoli that is able to have exchange. So how much air actually can be exchanged, we call that alveolar ventilation. So first we take our tidal volume times our respiratory rate. So how much air moves in and out per breath. But then we need to subtract from it our dead space volume times each respiration. So we said that our tidal volume is about 500 mLs, and we breathe about 1,200 times per minute. So that brought us up to 6,000 mLs. But the dead space volume, the part that doesn't get to the alveoli, we just said is 150 mLs per breath times 12 breaths. And that is 1,800 mLs out of that 6,000 mLs that is never exchanged. So how much air actually has gas exchange in a given minute? Roughly 4,200 mLs. Okay. And this is just showing you how minute alveolar ventilation can change looking at differences in tidal volume and respiratory rate.